Marvellous. Welcome, really welcome. Naturally, I think this is the most important session of the conference, so I'm glad to see a good turnout. And I want to say just a couple of things, and then I'll very quickly introduce my panellists so they don't have to sort of talk about themselves for too long. And then we've had quite a lot of questions submitted, but I really would like this to be as interactive as possible. I think we've had some great conversations this morning and yesterday, and certainly whenever patients, the idea of patients as a realistic and proximal concept have come up, there have been lots and lots of comments and questions from the floor, so let's sort of give more power to that. I'm somebody who came from Big Pharma and crossed the Rubicon into biotechnology about 10 years ago, and it's the best thing that's ever happened to me. Firstly, because I've got to work in small organisations with some amazingly passionate and innovative people. And secondly, because I'm afraid that is the way of the world, and if you haven't gone bio yet, even if you're a chemist, you're definitely going to. So I was at university in the 1980s when we discovered chemicals, and I think that word was used advisedly because we literally kind of found them and went, oh, I wonder what this does. And so our model of drug development came from always accepting that there were things about the chemicals that we were working on. And, you know, we were very good at the chemistry and we fine-tuned them, but there were always going to be things that we didn't understand about the chemical drugs that we were giving to people. And we just accepted that because we discovered them. We found they'd done something. We didn't necessarily know everything about them. So that has kind of modelled the way in which we do drug development. And I fundamentally believe that we are heading for a movement into another room where genomics and proteomics and mapping out signalling pathways and so on will enable us to genuinely understand our disease areas and our diseases and our on and off target effects. So I think the way in which we research and bring medicines through development and then make a value argument on the quality of those treatments and the longevity that they should have and the price that they should command is going to fundamentally change for everybody. And I think if you're not ready for that, you need to sort of strap yourself in, basically. So I think biology is very important and leads us into a new age. But equally, I think that patients and the proximity of patients leads us into a new age. We've heard discussions already at the meeting about patients being on our minds, which is lovely, as patients being opportunities for us to gather some data, which is lovely. Patients are even, being involved in consultations with regulatory authorities, and so there are various pilots and activities going on with that now. So they are definitely more involved in what we are trying to do, whether that is something that sits comfortably with people or not. But equally, patients have taken their destinies into their own hands. There are many examples of, I've worked in rare diseases the last 5 years, very privileged to have done so. Patients, and their families who've sort of decided to take their destiny into their own hands and map out what their disease will mean, how they can try and bring forward research so that a cure can become a step closer. And they've actually found the pharmaceutical model often to be frustrating because it's quite slow to take up their innovative ideas and push things forward. So, so there are examples of patient organisations setting up non-for-profit pharma, which, Didier is representing Genathon here, and of setting up funds and pushing forward research and development work that they've paid for themselves. So, patients are the new model. And they're going to be there at the beginning and starting off research, and they're going to be at the end talking to regulators and talking to payers and helping value judgments to be made about the things that we develop. So that's definitely enough from me, and I'm going to shut up. I want to say a few things about my panel, and I'm afraid I brought the wrong printout with me, so I'm going to read it off my iPhone, but that's fine because I don't yet need reading glasses. So let's start with Nick first. So Nick is chairman of the AKU Society, and they're a patient group that help people with the ultra-rare disease alkaptonuria. He's also co-founder of Find a Cure, which is a charity supporting the growth of patient groups and encourages things like drug repurposing and research into the links between rare diseases and then common diseases. I've got to my immediate left Austin, who's come here from Almec, Diagnostics and Discovery. They're based in Northern Ireland. So he's an expert in personalised medicine and also in companion diagnostics. So I hope we get a chance to talk about those in the panel because they speak directly to patient-centred care. We have Josie Godfrey from NICE here. She's Associate Director of the Highly Specialised Technologies Group at NICE. She was instrumental in establishing this Highly Specialised Technologies programme, and it reviews and makes recommendations for new and existing drugs for very rare conditions within the NHS in England. And then last and not least, we have Didier Cazergue, who's Director of Regulatory Affairs at Genethon in France. Genethon is a wholly patient charity-owned gene therapy pharmaceutical company. They had the law in France changed so that patient organisation could be a pharmaceutical manufacturer, and they're not for profit. Interesting. So Didier has led regulatory affairs at Pierre Fabre. He comes today from Genethon, as I've said, and they work with the very large and well-funded French muscular dystrophy charity, AFM. So that's all of us. I think we have a lot of interesting perspectives to share with you. And I would like to just kick off with a question, really, a sort of a broad-based question. I start off with, I think, with Nick, and that is patient advocacy is something that's, become more and more important to all of us to understand. Can you help us to sort of give your perspective on why you think patient advocacy should be important to pharma executives?
Sure. I mean, I think the landscape has completely changed over the past 20 years with the advent of the internet and social media. If you think about it, 20, 25 years ago, as a patient group, how did you interact with patients? How did you actually get to speak to them, and how did you bring them together? Well, you had newsletters, print newsletters, you had telephone, you might have had the odd meeting or whatever. But now everything has changed because we can actually identify, recruit, motivate patients, do PR and all that much faster than actually most pharma companies. Because most pharma companies, from my understanding, having not worked in industry, but things are actually quite slow when it comes to communications, when it comes to patient recruitment, when it comes to all these things. And so that's why I think we're actually far ahead of the game when it comes to that from a patient advocate's point of view. Secondly, I think that patient advocates are increasingly educated, increasingly know a lot about their disease and actually what they're trying to accomplish. So I think they become kind of equal partners. I'll give you an example. There's my kids have got a disease called black bone disease, or alkaptonuria, and we set up a consortium with a pharma company called Swedish Orphan Biovitrum, with universities, with Liverpool University and Hospital. We set up clinical trial centres in France and Slovakia, in the UK. We recruited patients from around Europe. We set up patient groups around Europe, in the Middle East and the US and all that. And what we actually found, particularly nowadays because of the kind of new media, is that it was much easier for us to do these things actually than it was necessarily for industry or for the academic groups. So I think there's a very strong argument for having patient groups as a full partner in any drug development program.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I mean, Josie, you've actually, you do a bit of a roadshow, don't you, helping to talk to patient, especially rare disease patient groups who, talk to your own technology assessment group. But, what are you trying to achieve when you go and do those interactions?
So, as you say, Adina, I try to talk to patient groups as much as possible, working with some of the umbrella patient groups in the UK, so Genetic Alliance and Specialised Healthcare Alliance, because that enables us to reach many, and there's only one of me and an awful lot of patients, which is fantastic. We're really trying to make sure that people understand what the different roles are of the different organisations. I say the same thing, I suppose, to industry as to patient groups, which is marketing authorization. The license is not the end of the journey. It's getting it to patients and getting it to the right patients. So, don't forget about NICE, don't forget about HTA until, you've already finished your phase 3 trials. Talk to us early, make sure we know what's coming. So whether it's NICE or a commissioner, we need to understand what's coming up, and we need to understand the benefits to patients of a product. So the science is great, but frankly, previously as a payer and an HTA body, I don't really care about a 6-minute walk test because it doesn't tell me much about what's happening to patients' lives when they take a new treatment. I care about that quality of life, and that's the value we have to understand. And you can't get at that unless you're talking to patients. You can't understand what real benefit your product might deliver unless you're talking to patients right at the beginning. So.
Actually, I mean, do you think that that means that, you know, the development needs to be attacked in a different way to fit with, you know, the way that you need to assess? So obviously we're only talking about UK and England and Wales here, because that's, you know, where your remit lies. But
well, I think it's less. I mean, the assessment would be a byproduct of doing things differently, but the real beneficiaries would be patients, getting treatments, getting technologies that are actually meeting their needs and not trying to fit themselves around what is presented to them. So I would say, you know, would you design a car? Would you design a, you know, if you didn't know anybody wanted it? And that's, I don't work in industry, but to my mind, it doesn't make sense to go so far down a road of developing a product before you've actually found out what people want and need.
Yeah, okay, very good. Didier, can I ask you a question?
Yes.
On behalf of AFM, so I hope you can answer on behalf of Genethon. Why was a company established rather than being able to work with the industry that already existed? Why did Genethon come into being?
We need to make a little story. In fact, when AFM was created, AFM is a French association against muscular dystrophy. In the year 60, nobody was looking for these diseases. There's no diagnostic available, so the children die. And then a group of parents would like to work together and to develop something. And at the beginning, they work with clinicians, and they see that the clinicians even have no power and no possibility to make research for this. So they decided to create their own structure. And based on that, they import for the US something called Téléthon. And Téléthon, it's a 30 hours program marathon, a lot of local activities in French cities. And then last year, for example, we get 89 million euros. Okay, from these charity programs. And based on that, they create their own structure for R&D, and they also supporting for academic research. As an example, today there's more than 300 fundamental research programs and more than 35 clinical trials ongoing. Not all of them as on gene therapy, but a global point of view. And then 10 years ago, they create some structure, Genethon, which is focused on gene therapy, and ISTEM with focus on cell therapy. And both of them are working on rare disease, not only muscular dystrophy, but global rare disease. And very recently, as you said, we have our own manufacturing, and we are today a pharmaceutical manufacturer, agreed by the French agency under GMP conditions, everything. And of course, today what we want to develop our own product, okay? And this product to be available on the market as soon as possible for all the patients. Okay, this is a major point for us. And as examples, we have on gene therapy product 5 clinical trials ongoing, some in US, here in UK, and of course in France, and very soon in Germany, and focus on pediatric immunodeficiency, eye disease, and also, of course, muscular dystrophy.
Yes, yeah. So my sort of, you know, understanding, broad brush, is that this is a group of people who said we want to do things differently, yes, and we want to focus on disease areas that are neglected, and so therefore we're going to do it ourselves.
Exactly, yes.
Yeah, yeah. And you know, now you have an established organisation there who's, you know, actually doing something, yes, significant. So.
Yes, and we are structure, even if we are non-profit structure, we are exactly same structure as a pharmaceutical, yes, industry, yeah, with people focus, yeah, on research, development, regulatory affairs, clinicals, and productions.
Yes, understood. Now, we've all been talking about therapeutics, and you know, I've been focusing on therapeutics, you know, all of yesterday as well. But you know, we have Austin here who can talk really more about companion diagnostics and how these different technologies can fit together. I mean, you know, I'm interested in the fundamental diseases, and we had a very interesting conversation, for example, about being able to use individual patient data to help to sort of repurpose and target what you're doing with, you know, using a companion diagnostic.
Absolutely, and I mean, it follows on from what Didier said. One of the key things with rare diseases is correct diagnosis of the disease. And when we talk about patient groups, to give an idea, something I was thinking about earlier, Leroy Hood, who founded the Institute of Systems Biology, talks about 4 Ps of medicine, which is predictive, preventative, personalised, and participatory. And when we talk about companion diagnostics, we're talking about prediction of response. We're talking about correct diagnosis of the disease. When we talk about personalised, we're talking about giving therapies based on the patient's needs and on the indication that they have. And then the participatory component is this whole idea of patient advocacy groups becoming involved. And I think all of this links together to create what we would think of as true personalised medicine, where we'll be in a situation where we can correctly diagnose a disease, even if it is a rare or orphan indication, where we can identify what therapy can be given to that patient based on their molecular makeup or the specific form of the disease they have, and ultimately advance human health from that perspective.
So would you regard patient advocacy groups as a stakeholder in the same way as you might regard an academic expert or a...
Yeah, and I think that we have to. You know, we've seen this particularly in the world of companion diagnostics and personalised medicine. It's been the early pharma companies who first developed companion diagnostics worked very closely with patient advocacy groups to help the patient advocacy groups understand why they needed the HER2 test for the drug Herceptin. Because when Herceptin first came around for breast cancer, there was instant, huge news about this new breakthrough medication that had incredibly good results in breast cancer patients. And there was an immediate desire by patients. They say, well, why can I not be given this therapy? And so it was realized early on that patients had to understand what the diagnostic was, and that there are a certain subsection of the patients who can respond to the drug and a subsection who can't. And in fact, it's around 80% of patients can't even be given the drug. And so it's important to work with patient advocacy groups at a grassroots level and not just with clinicians or key opinion leaders to ensure that patients understand this new approach to personalised medicine.
It sounds a bit multifactorial though as well. I mean, the idea that you become ill and you take one treatment, but it sounds like we need to be also educating folks that they need to be able to adopt the technologies that can help them to, produce more data, produce more diagnostic data, interact with their healthcare provider or the decision maker on their healthcare. And we've talked this morning about whether that should be remotely, using other technologies or face-to-face as well. So.
Yeah, I think that's that whole component of the participatory part of this, where patients are participating in their own healthcare.
Yeah.
There's the quantified self idea, where patients are measuring their own data, where patient advocacy groups are understanding what that data means, and ultimately driving research to support that.
And one thing that we touched on this morning was, someone made a point, well, we were all talking about using apps to feed back to pharma developers and to pharma companies and your healthcare provider. But actually, even those folks who are, are outside of the range of, the ages where you're happy to use an app, because there are, geriatric, patients and there are, paediatric patients too, all have caregivers. Yes. So it's really about the front end being as easy to adopt as possible for whoever it is dealing with the care. I mean, technology is definitely going to be a wave that comes along and changes our world a little bit. But what other sort of shifts do you think that the pharma industry, perhaps I'll start with you, Nick, needs to make to be able to allow patient-led innovations and patient-led assistance to have a beneficial effect on development?
I think it's probably a cultural shift. So I think there's probably a need for a cultural shift, but also, because what we've seen, and again, it's just from our limited experience, but what we've seen is that there seems to be not necessarily reticence, but yes, actually a reticence sometimes, particularly from the larger pharmaceutical groups, of actually engaging with patients. And that could be because of, there are certain codes of conduct that they need to follow. But also I wonder whether, just in their systems and their culture, whether the patient engagement is actually done, just kind of considered enough, fundamentally, really. And so I would think that if there was a change of culture, a culture towards kind of accepting that the patients might actually have a very good understanding that they might actually have something to bring to the table, which is beyond just being ill, then I think things could actually move in the right direction.
Josie, would you?
Sorry, I was looking at the man waving his hand.
Sorry, I'll come over. So we were just saying, are there things that pharma need to do differently to, the obvious things that would help, so when they come to you, that that they've actually talked and consulted and are bringing the whole picture to you?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm increasingly encouraging industry colleagues, and I talk to them to approach at least one HTA body for some early scientific advice. You might not want it from NICE, you might not want it from everyone, but at least talk to one of the European bodies, because we do want different things from regulators. And I think, Nick talks about cultural change, bringing patients in, and I see it as well a cultural shift needing to think beyond that point of getting a license, beyond getting the tick from the regulators to getting the treatment to patients, to getting appropriate access. And we need to understand the disease, we need to understand the natural history of the disease, which in very rare conditions is often very poorly understood. The people who hold that data, that information, are typically the patients, and working without them by your side, you're not going to be able to present information about natural history. That's just for a start. Then you start looking at the impact of the treatment and how it fits within the current care pathway in any country that you're trying to get reimbursed. I mean, the patient has got to be, absolutely part of that discussion. We talk directly to patients, but we expect to see submissions from companies to also accurately reflect patient experience.
I mean, Didier, do you think Genethon does things differently because you're patient-owned, or do you think you fall into the same culture trap as all pharma?
I don't think we may think differently. In my opinion, in the past, patient associations and the pharmaceutical industry work on a parallel way because they don't know themselves and there's no exchange. And now, in the last 10 years, things have changed. It's a very large patient association. I understand they have to work with pharmaceuticals in a win-to-win relations. And I completely agree with what you say. We have much more relation with biotech and little pharmaceutical company compared to very big company, pharmaceutical company. I think that big pharmaceutical company have perhaps some problem to work with patient association and also be very prudent regarding the scientific evolutions.
Oh, yeah, that's true. Okay. I'm going to ask you that question in a second. I just want to come to Keith, if I can, to make sure that I answer.
Hello, yeah. It was really on the discussion you were having. I think I went to a talk recently around social media and the legal implications of the use thereof. And frankly, I think Big Pharma have had their fingers burnt quite badly a few times. So I think the reticence is not just because they don't want to do it, but where they have tried in the past, they've kind of got hoisted up for trying to engage with patients, and patients saying things like, I feel much better when I've taken this particular drug. If it's on a site sponsored by that company, then they are in breach of some of their ethical requirements. So I think it's not quite as clear cut as them not wanting to do that. I feel like I'm defending the pharma companies here, but I think it's not quite so straightforward, and I think the regulators have got quite a lot to answer for around that.
Yes, I think coming back to the question, what way do things need to be done differently? That's a wall that does need to be knocked down. That threat of inappropriate patient engagement.
Yeah.
Which, yeah. Can we take a question over here, please?
Ian Holborn. It's more of a comment on the last thing. I would say it's probably the sequencing of when Big Pharma engages with patient groups. It's usually post-marketing authorisation activity, which is maybe more cynical. Let's get the patients on side after we've got over the regulatory hurdle, as opposed to really engaging with the patients at the time when you're developing the product and really understanding what their needs are.
Yeah, it sounds daft, doesn't it? I mean, there was that discussion about Coca-Cola this morning. I mean, can you imagine launching a soft drink and never asking anyone to try it or finding out what they thought until you got it in the shops? I mean, it's a nonsense. So, Massimo.
Yeah, more than question is an observation, because it's interesting the experience of Genethon. We have something similar in Italy that is based on Teleton.
Yes.
But I was thinking now, so basically you said that everything starting from a small group of patients or parents anyway.
Parent of patient, exactly.
So, and now you grew up to the end, because basically you are able to complete the discovery, the development, and the production, okay?
Yeah.
So what you are telling us is that the patient took the control of the entire process. It's an observation, okay?
But you can tell that. But for example, today we have a big questions because we are not very far from marketing authorizations. Are we ready to market a product, or would you like to do it with a pharmaceutical industry? We don't know. We are open to every possibility. But what we think today is that we have to work together with the pharmaceutical industry, okay? Because we don't know all what is pharmaceutical development, marketing, and everything. Even in Genethon, we are most of people who work in development, production, clinical development, regulatory affairs are coming from the industry. We are not today as strong as a pharmaceutical industry. Okay, so commercialization is a big question for us. Are we ready to put a product on the market, or would like to do it with a pharmaceutical industry? I think we can do both, and we are open to every solution. But of course, you can take the controls of the production, but use development. But this is only for gene and cell therapy, because nothing would like to do it 10 years ago.
No, absolutely.
Nobody would like to do it 10 years ago.
Intentionally, I'm stretching a little bit of the discussion. Absolutely, I see the point. But I mean, in some way, part of the answer would be, yeah, for us, okay, yes. At least for this specific experience, was much easier to build, seems from scratch, the entire story than getting in contact with existing pharma companies. That's the point.
I wonder if the existing pharma companies are ready to, move into gene and cell therapy with 2 feet. I mean, what do people here think? Does anyone have any experience of developing these in a big pharma context?
I'm Günter Busam from Novartis. I think Novartis takes a big step into that direction, cell and gene therapy. So in May there was a unit formed called Cell and Gene Therapy. I think there's the aspiration to be the leader in that field. So we didn't start, let's say, 10 years ago, but we start off that one. So it's clearly recognized, and we liaise, I think, more with the small companies who has the experience and survived probably the last 15 years, because on this cell and gene therapy, I think this was a hype. Yeah. At one point, it went down. I think there was a lot of euphoria in the market, but I think it's coming back. And what I see right now in the press, in announcements, there's a lot of ongoing in the industry around cell and gene therapy. For my personal reading, it's still a very immature industry, but it has a lot of promise and a lot of hope in that, and I think it's going to realize as well.
I'm personally very, very keen that pharma should get engaged. I mean, despite my comment this morning about farmers leaving biotechs alone, 10 years ago or 15 years ago, monoclonal antibodies were terribly exotic, and they occurred somewhere on the west coast of America, and you may have lost or made some money on buying some of their shares if you were feeling adventurous. But they really were something that was very strange, like space exploration, and terribly specialised. They didn't touch any of our lives. Whereas within a 5-year period, every major pharma company, and AstraZeneca was the last one, had invested in monoclonal antibody companies. So they had subsumed the technology by bringing the companies on board. And I genuinely feel that we are heading for that kind of sea change again in the industry where genetic therapies are concerned. So it's I think it's coming soon, to a pharma near you, really. Sarah.
Thank you. I'm interested in some of the comments that Didier's made about the fact that the way that you operate and are structured are like a traditional pharmaceutical company. But I wonder if you could say a little bit more about how the ownership of the company by patients and by carers influences different aspects of what you do, because obviously the ownership model could say we want investment into these diseases which are neglected by traditional pharmaceuticals, and that's about an ownership and funding model that says invest into this area in a more philanthropic way. But presumably it goes beyond that, and it's much more about changing the way in which pharmaceutical research and development is done to engage the patient at all levels, rather than what we've been hearing elsewhere, which is adding it on at the end.
So, regarding the structure, for example, in the board of Geneton is an association, what is a non-profit association. There's a specific rule for that in France. In the board of Geneton, there's parents of children and also people coming from the industry and from research, fundamental research. In the active management, there's only people with experience for research, for clinical development, for regulatory affairs. Okay. And of course, the investment is decided by the board, by the IFM. But regarding the research activity, it's much more open. In fact, in IFM, there is a structure who is supporting groups of research, fundamental research, okay? Even if it's not focused on muscular dystrophy, just to see if there's potential, okay? And there's plenty of programs, fundamental research, just support to see if there's a potentials, okay? Of course, when you come into developments, it's much more expensive, and we have money, but not a lot compared to some other pharmaceutical industry, so we are obliged to make a choice, okay? And this choice has been made on the vector we are able to know to produce. And there, for example, in manufacturing, we are able to produce some AAV and some lentiviral vectors for gene therapy. So we are focused on this program. So there's eyes programs, pediatric immunodeficiency, some disease for muscular dystrophy, of course, SMA, and also for liver disease. Okay, so of course, in this case, you're obliged to make choice because productions for gene therapy and clinical trials for gene therapy are very, 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 very expensive. Sometimes I would like to add regarding the fact that very big pharma are not coming to orphan drug or to gene therapy. I think there's also the fact that there's a structure, okay, in the big pharma, and they are not keen to develop rare diseases. Because when you are developing a rare disease, you are not following your traditional programs. And even more, if you are in gene therapy, the program is completely different. And very often, you are in the position where you open the door when discussing with the authorities, and even more for EMA, because the guidelines don't go so fast as science. Yes. Okay? So I completely understand that in this position, biotech are more able to move and more quickly. And big pharma, even if they are interesting, but they have big structure and they are able to make traditional developments, and this is not very well adapted to rare disease development.
I think that's a very important role that we play. We're more willing to pick up the phone, and speak to somebody, at a reimbursement agency or EMA and say, what do you think, and can we come and talk to you?
Exactly.
We don't, in biotech, we don't have reams of other products on the market, or we're not about to go and speak to the head of neurology and the FDA next week, and so there's no other risks that that we're taking. I think that's the advantage, if you want to call it that we have to do things differently.
Yes. Another point that's also important is that the development that is made not only by Geneton but in rare disease could be also very interesting for frequent disease. For example, if you are speaking about rare eye disease, this could be very interesting for age degenerations of macula. And the way we are working on AAV or lentivirus or gene therapy process could be also very interesting for not rare disease, like Parkinson's disease. Today in the US, there is being trials in Parkinson's diseases. So I think we have to think that new developments we are making for rare disease, new technology which is developed for rare disease could be very useful for frequent disease.
Yeah, no, I absolutely. What I want to bring in here is Austin, because the opposite is also true. Pharma may feel, we can't do rare disease, in some cases, but you explained to me a very nice example of where a rare disease has come out of more common diseases because the companion diagnostics have been able to point out a particular patient subgroup. So.
Yeah, and I mean, in terms of the pharma industry and where they stand, I think we are starting to see a bit of a shift from the traditional models, which is all patients being given the same drug, the blockbuster model. And I think a really good example of that is where recently Pfizer developed a new therapy for lung cancer, which is far from a rare disease. I mean, there's 500,000 patients in the US diagnosed every year. It's the largest, most common form of cancer. It's the most deadly form of cancer. But there's a specific genetic subtype within lung cancer where there's a translocation in a gene called ALK. Okay, and this is a very rare translocation. Probably between 1% and 5% of patients have this. But Pfizer recently actually developed a drug called Xalkori, which has incredibly good response rates in this incredibly small subset of lung cancer patients. So by the use of a companion diagnostic, i.e. looking at the actual translocation of the ALK gene, they've actually created an orphan drug indication within lung cancer, which is far from an orphan drug indication. And by this means, they're able to target a much smaller group of patients, but with a therapy that's much more successful. And even from a development perspective, that was put onto the FDA's accelerated approval program. It was brought through in less than 12 months with a joint approval of the drug and the diagnostic. And that drug is now in the clinic and working very successfully. So we're starting to see that actually more commonly. And even some of the clients we're working with, they're looking at rare lymphomas. They're looking at much more rare diseases where we are now running multiple trials in diseases that 5-10 years ago people weren't touching at all. Because there is pharma are starting to recognize that there are these niches that they can target. And by using a diagnostic and having a companion product like that, they can develop a much stronger product for the patients.
Yeah. And how did that come about? I mean, do you think that they're still relying on serendipity, or are they out there, genuinely sort of, looking at the genome and saying, where can we see particular places of interest where we can apply what we've already got?
I think it's a combination of both. I think, as you said, there was the point about gene therapy earlier. 15 years ago, there was a real huge interest in gene therapy. Similarly, 15 years ago, there was a huge interest in genomics. Now that we've sequenced the genome, what new therapies will we come up with? And there was that initial plateau of interest, and then there were no products, no successes, and everyone thought, there's been a bit of a, that's not as much of a success as we hoped. But, the pharma industry does move slowly. And so the thing is that it's only now 10 years later that we're really starting to see these disease indications being focused on, these new targets being focused on, and these genetic mutations or changes that actually need to be analysed are now in the pipeline.
Okay. Let's switch to sort of patient-owned data for a sec. There's been a number of discussions I've heard, here and previously about how patient ownership of data might be in the future. And clearly some enabling technologies are one level of the discussion. But I think, like it or not, patients are going to be able to at least have at their fingertips, if they want, their non-invasive biomarker data. It's theirs, it belongs to them. We have some barriers in the UK. People are very mistrustful of allowing their GPs to have electronic records. So there's a bit of kind of cynicism and fear barrier to get over as well. But I wanted to ask, and perhaps start with Josie, what do you think could be the first enablers to have patients come and say, we have, you talked about natural history data, for example. We have some data that could be useful to you. What in your dream might that data look like?
Wow, fantasy world. I think about somebody I know, Christine Lavery, who runs MPS Society, and she's spent years working with patients, developing registries, developing really detailed understanding of in this case, lysosomal storage disorders, and it's a fantastic resource that we can call on. Basically, we kind of know where all the patients in the country are. So it's a great resource for us to be able to draw on what that patient experience is like, but a great resource for industry to be able to identify where trials could take place, to be able to find people to participate in research. So it's a sort of win-win. But the big challenge about ownership of data, I think I've found less of a hurdle in the rare disease space when there's no other treatment, because patients are so willing to take more risks, so willing to be more involved, that they're just desperate for people to take what they've got to offer. And so anything that can encourage that. I've taken on board comments about regulators and stuff. There are some blockers in the system. We can chip away at that, hopefully.
Nick, what do you think?
I think things are moving quite fast in this area. I'll talk a bit about our personal experience, which is on a number of fronts. One is, a couple of years ago, we set up an alkaptonuria community on Patients Like Me, and I think most of you have probably heard of Patients Like Me, but basically it's a series of communities where patients can actually gather data on their own condition. And we thought this was very interesting because we thought that, well, at last, because up until then, a lot of these online patient communities were narrative-based communities where people swap stories. And, there's only so far you can go swapping stories. But when you start to empower patients to gather their own data and to actually track over time how they're doing, things start to become very interesting. And not only that, but it allows us to export the data anonymously. So we can actually, start to get an idea. I mean, obviously this is not like doing a registry, it's not like a clinical study or anything like that, but it does give you an idea. And also, the problems that you have is that some patients will go in every day and put in their information, others once a year, so there's all kinds of problems, with it. But it's still very interesting, and I think it's going to increase. The other area we have is using a company called Patients Know Best. Now, they all have similar names, which gets a bit confusing. But Patients Know Best is all about patient-controlled medical records. And this is very important because anybody who's had any experience in the NHS knows that there's no such thing really as confidentiality. I mean, it is, you go to the GP and then you go to the practice nurse and all your records are up there on a screen and everyone wondering, but I can see it. And you just kind of think, this is really not great. And what Patients Know Best do, and what we do with them, is that the patient is in control of their medical records. They gain control of them, and they then say which doctor, which GP, which nurse can actually have access to them and all that, and they can then revoke the rights. So it kind of puts really the patient at the centre, and it's all heavily encrypted and all that kind of stuff. And the third area really is registries. And last week we were at a conference and there was Sanford Research who were presenting something which seems very interesting, which we're going to look into, which is basically they have now a service to set up free registries for rare diseases, any rare disease, entirely free. And it looks absolutely fantastic. So we're going to be looking at that.
Okay, very cool. Very cool. Is that Sanford or
Sanford,
Sanford?
S-A-N-F-O-R-D.
Shall I just see if there are any questions from the floor at this moment? We seem to be talking amongst ourselves, rather.
Thanks. Just a thought struck me about this business about digitizing the pill, so that payers in particular can examine the compliance records of patients. The first question is obviously if a medicine is deemed not to be effective, are they taking the medicine at a particularly efficacious regime? Are patients holding their end of the bargain, so to speak? How does that really? Does that really clash with this idea of patients owning all of their information and data records, or is there a way that we can combine the patient's rights in that respect with the payer's rights in sort of providing that extra value proposition that additional compliance information will bring?
I think that's definitely going to be one for you, Josie.
I thought it might be, yeah. I guess my first thought is that I tend to flip it. If patients aren't complying with a treatment regimen, maybe it's not the right treatment regimen. And maybe it's less about patients upholding their end of the bargain than thinking, well, why are patients not taking it? Is it because it's a huge burden and the benefit isn't worth it? That tells me a huge amount about the value of a technology that we're looking at. And it's right back to what I said right at the beginning. If you're not talking to patients about what they want and need, you may well end up with a product that patients don't then take, and that isn't. In terms of owning the data, it is a challenge, but one of the reasons we work so closely with the patient groups is to be able to get them to come forward with those kinds of information, because ultimately patient groups want the right treatment for patients, not the wrong treatment that just happens to be there but isn't really working for them. So it's not easy, but I think it's that dialogue, and it's that continual dialogue that means that people are more willing to trust their data into different things. If they understand how it's used, if they understand the process that it's going into, then we find people are more willing to share than if it just looks like a big black scary box that decides whether or not they get money or not.
Can I ask Josie one thing, and that's something that I've heard from patient organisations and parents, is a concern that if various new technologies are being developed in one therapeutic area where previously there's unmet medical need, does the first one get all of your budget and attention, and do the others basically wilt by the wayside, or is there some sort of evaluation process whereby when you end up with a number of choices you can adjust how much spend there is on each of those?
Yeah, it really depends on the situation. So there's my non-answer for you. If it's really almost an alternative, of the same patient groups, then often once you've already gone through introducing the first therapy, you can actually just manage the entry of a second or third without needing to invoke over a nice technology appraisal or an HS, a highly specialised technology evaluation, or a formal commissioning policy, because it's manageable within the budget of a service. So it's only really when that's not the case that you start to come up against challenges. We would hope that there's no disadvantage to being the second, but similarly, we also know that if there are a lot more products, we would hope to see that drive price down. I mean, that's just, that's why we want competition. We want better drugs for less money. And of course we do. We want to get more to more patients. We haven't really seen that happening in the ultra-orphan fields, in the very rare diseases. So for something like Gaucher, there's now more than one treatment available. A lot of the diseases I deal with, there really is nothing or maybe one treatment. So I think we're a long way off seeing that competition. Make them cheaper, that'd be great.
But you think it'll bed down rather than needing different incentives for very innovative developments for rare disease?
I would hope so, but it's such an early stage, and it's taken a long time to get to the point where there are sort of 6 or 7 drugs in the enzyme replacement therapies, but it feels like it's speeding up. And that might just be my perception, but it feels as if it's...
Yeah, no, I'd agree too. I just want to ask Nick something, because I want to come back to the idea that we discussed before the meeting, and we haven't had a chance to raise it here yet, and that's about repurposing. And the idea that you have existing treatments out there that can be repositioned. Now we understand the genetics of conditions, and we understand which patient groups might benefit particularly. I mean, can you say anything about that for us? Because I know it's something that you feel strongly about.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, in my personal case, the drug we're developing for alkaptonuria is a repurposed drug. It actually originally was a weed killer. It's called nitisinone, and the guy who discovered it, a scientist, I think he was at ICI, noticed that it came from around the bottlebrush plant in his garden. There were no weeds, and he synthesized the drug, nitisinone, and now the second most sold weed killer in the world is an analog called mesotrione. And then this drug nitisinone, because it works in the tyrosine pathway in plants and in humans, was then, through lateral thinking, they thought, well, we could use that to cure a disease called tyrosinemia type 1, and it's been an absolute miracle drug. I mean, kids with tyrosine type 1 used to die by age 3 of liver cancer. Now they're in full health. It's absolutely incredible. And it works on the same metabolic pathway as alkaptonuria. So some guys at the NIH about 10, 15 years ago thought, well, it should be able to work for alkaptonuria. So that's a good case of drug repositioning, and we're now doing these trials. We're in a phase 3 trial. We've nearly finished recruiting all our patients, and we've got then another 3-4 years to go to get the data. So that kind of opened our eyes to this whole idea of drug repositioning. It's not a new concept. People have been talking about it for a long time. Okay. But at Find a Cure, what we've done is we've teamed up with an American group called Cures Within Reach to look at how we can reposition generic drugs for rare diseases, because there's no IP for these drugs, no one's interested in actually developing them. And so what we've been looking at is the concept of a social impact bond, because the problem that we get is if we always depend on grant money to reposition these drugs, we're going to take forever. And there's a whole bunch of these drugs out there to be repositioned. I mean, Bruce Bloom at Cures Within Reach, he's got a network of hundreds of different physicians and scientists. And when he put out a call, a few months ago to find out who had drugs to reposition, he had something like 50 or 60% of people coming back saying, well, we could use that drug for that, and that drug for that, and that drug for that. So there's a gold mine. But the key problem is, one, a market failure because of there's no IP, and secondly, where does the funding come from? So we're working on this idea of using what's called social impact bonds, where, in a nutshell, what happens is you need to find a payer, so in this case, potentially the NHS, who says, yes, if you develop the drug, we will pay you on success based on how much we actually save on treatment. And that then allows you to go and raise money from investors. Because you can say, if we develop the drug, we'll get paid and you'll get your money back plus some. And that then allows you to create a virtuous circle to then redevelop more and more, reposition more and more drugs. So for us, it's very early stage. We're trying to put all these things together to come with something that works, but we're pretty hopeful.
That's disruptive enough for you? Didier, please, sorry, and then I'll come back to...
I think that repositioning is very important, because if we think to gene cell therapy, it will be available in 5-6 years. So we need something for the patient during these times. And also at AFM, we are supporting some repositionings for the drug. But we think, and we are positioned, that is not our job, because our job normally will be to go for a new gene therapy, cell therapy, or even, if it's possible, new molecules. Okay, I'm also involved in another structure called TreatNMD. It has been created by also patient associations from US and Europe and supported by European programs. And they created an expert group, Americans and US and European. And we are make evaluations of products. And most of the time, these products are coming from a little pharmaceutical structure or university, and most of the time is repositioning. Okay, and what the patient association either in France or US ask for this, they ask this assessment made by this TACT, this is the expert group for TreatNMD, and of course sometimes they support and they give money to support the development of these products. And for me, even if I'm working on gene and cell therapy, I think that repositioning is something very, very, very important.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm going to say diagnostics must, obviously play a big part in that. So you must be sort of thinking.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think this idea as well. What you just said, the idea of understanding the pathway that a drug targets and then changing the way that you're treating, that's something that again we look at very much fundamentally when we look at the biology of a disease. And quite often we don't necessarily fully understand the mechanism of action of a drug. And the more we can explore that and understand the fundamental biology of a disease, the more we can look at how drugs can be better used, either repurposed, repositioned, or used in more intelligent combinations.
Yeah.
So, target two different pathways within the same disease, and you've got chance of synergistic effects, as opposed to what may happen where you have a standard clinical trial, we're using standard of care with a DNA damaging agent and then adding a new DNA damaging agent to this as well. That's actually quite commonly happens in registrational trials. And so by understanding the actual basis of the disease, by understanding the molecular basis of the disease, it greatly increases your chance of giving successful therapies or, again, repurposing a drug that's already available.
Yeah, but the model's got to exist, hasn't it? Yeah. Kerry, you wanted to ask a question, didn't you?
Yeah, I was just curious because from a Genethon point of view, that it's a different ownership model and that it's led by patients, it's got that, new scenario. Is there a review process that looks at all the different things that you've got in clinical trial to see, in the end of the day, what patients want is treatments or cures, to see which ones maybe need to be pushed ahead or prioritized, which wouldn't necessarily happen in Big Pharma? It's a different process where, maybe something's quite far down the line, but something is looking more promising from behind that maybe needs to be prioritized. Is that taken into account in the model?
Yes, in fact, we have a scientific committee of persons who are outside of Genethon, outside of AFM, who make an evaluations of our project at the end of the proof of concept phase. Okay. Then regarding clinical trials, the priority is given to muscular dystrophies because it's the heart of our associations. And secondly, we also choose some disease where gene therapy could have great success, because it's important, I think, today to show that gene therapy could be successful in some disease. In other disease, it will be complicated, but in some disease, it could be interesting for VIs. I think that we'd have in a very near future great success in paediatric or immunodeficiency, or which is immune deficiency. You can have also great success. So we have a sort of mixing, because muscular dystrophies are a priority, but also it's important to prove that gene therapy could work in some model diseases. Okay, but for the proof of concept, I say there's external scientific committee who is in charge. It's very important because for us, because most of our money are coming from the public.
I mean, you asked a very sensible question, because in pharma that's privately funded, money and the likelihood of success is a very easy quantitative measure that we use to be able to look at our pipelines and do our portfolio prioritizations. But of course, if you're a not-for-profit and it's the science that's driving you along, then you need to look for some other kind of qualitative measure to use for the judgments on prioritisation, because time isn't necessarily the only factor. How long will it take and who will get there first? We're not running a race here, are we? I don't know if anyone's got any comments on that. But not-for-profit does present a few issues. Let me come back to the smaller patient groups, because Genethon, I really represent the very large end of the scale, and they're very different and unique, and that's why I'm very glad that Didier's here. But I mean, Nick, you're part of Find a Cure is to sort of help other patient groups to get themselves set up. And one of my fears is always that we're too granular. There's too many, broken up and disparate groups. But I can understand that if you are representing uniquely, a small disease area, that you have to have a voice. So what are you saying are the success factors that you would try to teach people who come to you and say, we want to form a patient association? Sure.
I mean, the big problem we see is that as a patient group, we're all trying to reinvent the wheel because, I know that 10 years ago when we set up the AKU Society, we didn't really have much of a clue. I mean, I'm not saying we do more now, but we really didn't have a clue then. And what we didn't know is, how to raise funds, how to do a clinical trial, how to interact with scientists, how to interact with industry, how to recruit patients, how to motivate patients, what was a natural history, all these kinds of things. And even though the diseases are all very different, the challenges are all really the same. So what we're trying to do with Find a Cure, because we're often approached by patient groups, people saying, I want to set up a patient group, what do I do, and everything. So basically what we do is we're putting together a kind of curriculum through which they can go, and also a series of workshops, and we're just launching a peer mentoring program in 2 days on Friday, where we'll be matching up experienced patient groups with new patient groups to teach them all these things. I'll give an example. One of the things that I really encourage patient groups is to go out there and meet with industry. I mean, for us, it's been incredibly beneficial meeting with industry. And what we explain to them is that unless you go and meet with industry, how are you going to develop treatments? It's great that you're working with scientists and with academics, but to be honest, they don't really have that much of a clue when it comes to the whole regulatory process and how to get a thing into the clinic. So we kind of teach them all these different things, and hopefully, then what we'll see is a patient group sector which has a much stronger capacity, which is much more professionalised and much more able to interact on an equal footing with all the different stakeholders.
What about politicians and the government? I mean, aren't they also...
Well, they are, but there are very good policy groups out there. In the rare disease space, we have Rare Disease UK, we have the Genetic Alliance. In Europe, we have Eurordis and all that. So they're doing great policy work. So us as Find a Cure, we've decided not to do policy work.
Right, okay. But you're trying to sort of focus on how
we focus on the hands-on, the real gap in the market, which was the capacity building, the training of these patient groups on kind of day-to-day mechanisms to improve themselves.
I mean, people from patient organisations will often say to me with some frustration, why does it take so long? Why does drug development take so long? And, why can't some of the roadblocks be ridden over and accelerated? I mean, Elizabeth Vroom always uses the analogy that, if you're driving your car down the road, you must drive safely and follow the rules. But if you've got someone who might die, you drive an ambulance as safely as you can, but you go faster. And does anyone have anything, that they can offer up as pointers for where is it that if you have an urgent and life-threatening disease for a small number of subjects and maybe you're repurposing, are there things that can be done to go faster? Are there new approaches that you could try?
Nick Stevens.
Hi, Nick.
Hi. Yes, there are, but not very many. Whether there should be or not is a different question. I think if you think about drug development, there is a gap that you look for between efficacy and safety, and all drugs are poisons, right? And you accept a much narrower gap in more critical or life-threatening diseases. And I think especially in rare disease, it's sensible to use the science, but then to allow parents and patients to decide whether the risk is acceptable. I think we've moved into a different world now where those judgments can be made. The main reason why organizations don't do them is financial. It's the financial consequences of taking that risk are immense, but you're talking about very limited patient groups again. So there must be some way that you can, in effect, sign an insurance waiver and say, I've understood the science, I've understood this, my child will die without it, I'm prepared to take the chance. There should be a mechanism for that in today's world.
Do you feel that's the fundamental blocker to being able to do what you need to do?
The Medicines Act was a wonderful thing, and it was done for very good reasons, but hasn't kept up with scientific progress or the understanding of risk.
Yeah. And the desire, I think, to sort of, make progress on behalf of the community, the patient community that we're trying to address, I think, being much more knowledgeable now and wanting to take their destinies, by their own hands, I think is something that, when I look around the room, a lot of us, when we started out, that was something that, certainly we didn't learn at school, did we? So.
I think that there's one thing I would mention there, that from the world of oncology, as you say, that there is a shift there. There is a different way of looking at things where in oncology there's no healthy volunteers in phase 1. We're treating patients from phase 1. And we're actually now running biomarker stratification studies for pharma clients for phase 1. So not only are they treating critically ill patients, they're actually using stratification to ensure that they're treating the right patients. So we're actually stratifying phase 1 trials, which is ultimately, from most of those trials that I've seen in progress, they're basically phase 1, phase 2 joint trials. And I think the overall objective from the clients is that they're actually not going to have a break. They're going to have adaptive designs, and they'll go from phase 1 through to registration in a single ongoing trial. It basically just expands with new cohorts. So there are different modifications that can be made that can get us there faster.
Yes, I think you can do that and have less data points because you've got the same people.
Exactly.
If you have more precision in your measurements and in your subtyping of the subjects that you've got. Yeah, very good. Didier, one last very short comment because we're about to run out of time.
I think today the agency are moving their way. If you have, for example, a very rare disease, you can then discuss with the agency, IMA, or national agency, and discuss with them and to, for example, make a clinical trials only with 10 patients and submit with 5 patients, depending of your endpoint. Okay, but also it's very, very important to discuss with the agency. In the national agency where you have put your clinical trial, but also with EMA to discuss with them before you submit your dossier. Yeah. And in my opinion, if you have a very rare disease or rare disease, your clinical trial should be representative of your patient populations. Yeah. Okay? So if you have not a lot of patients, you can have very few patients in your clinical trials. And this is acceptable by the agency, but you have to discuss with them.
Again, that's a different world, isn't it, than the one we're used to? Well, we have run out of time. I want to thank you all for coming, and I want to thank the panel very much indeed for a really good discussion. So.